and we are going to use them to authenticate, to configure org2org. So before I start org2org, can anyone from the old batch attempt to explain what is an org2org?
I may be wrong, but I could take a crack at it if you'd like. Org2org is when you're taking two instances, you're joining two tenants of Okta, integrating them from one to the other through Saml, usually.
While one works as an IDP and the other works as a service provider.
Okay. And what use case is it delivering? Like, why do we need to integrate the two Okta together?
I was thinking about it. It could be a backup server. One could be a backup server, and one could be the regular provider, or it could be two separate servers communicating with each other.
How can one be a backup server? Like, for backup, both Okta should be similar. Then only one can act as a backup. But when we do the org2org integration, we never like copy the content from one Okta to another Okta. No, we don't do that. So it's not a backup server for sure.
I see. Okay.
Maybe like for an example, like an HR department tells the Okta admin to have a user that can integrate, some users on their own for maybe some group that they're in, and through that, you kind of make the second Okta tenant for them, but they're able to have the admin privileges for the time being.
Okay, so just for example, an Okta org for a medium organization or a small organization cost $253,000. Yeah, $253,000. Nobody would invest another $253,000 for a few group of users. Okay. So Okta Org2Org, you were right in the first part. We do integrate two Oktas together. So one Okta acts as an application and that other Okta acts as an identity provider. And the reason behind doing this is, let's say there are two different companies or a subsidiary of the same company, and they have an application or some project which they are working on. They need to collaborate together on a specific application or multiple applications. And those applications may be hosted by one of those subsidiaries or the companies. So the other company want to access the second application. Now, how do they enable a secure login for that application for the other company, which is not hosting this application? So there are two ways. One, if the application has an option to federate with multiple identity provider, we can leverage that. So like Salesforce has this option. You can federate with multiple identity providers. So if Salesforce is a common application between the two enterprises, it can be used with their own identity providers, no issues. But if it's a homegrown application, let's say my company has developed an application and other company members or the other company people, project members who want to collaborate with my company users on this project, on this application, and my application does not support multiple identity provider, it only supports a single identity provider, then this is not possible. Similarly, there are other so many applications which only supports one identity provider. And again, if just for a small project or collaboration or for something, you will not buy that specific application again. Just the example I gave you, right? Just for a small group of users, you will not buy a second Okta tenant and cost yourself a lot of money. So the other company who is collaborating with your company would not buy this product for 2 to 3 months just for fun, right? So what they would do is they would come up with this solution of Org2Org. So consider that both companies are using Oktas, right? So in that case, the company who is hosting the application can let the other company users log in to this application using their own credentials. Why we need to have their own credentials? For security. We don't want to store their credentials and compromise their security and take that risk on us, right? So we want to use their own credentials. Again, we are not asking them to share their credentials so that we can store. Storing is a major risk, right? We already know we have to do a lot of tokenization and all. So we are not storing their credential at our end. What we are doing is we are becoming an application for them. So we know Saml, single sign-on, right? A single sign-on happens between an identity provider and a service provider. Service provider being the application relies on the authentication system of the identity provider. And an identity provider is responsible to do the authentication and send the authentication information to the service providers, right? This is a well-known formula. We already know about it. So in this same concept, one company become an application to the other company. So that let's say if I want to collaborate with my company, which is Deloitte, want to collaborate with Accenture, then and Deloitte is having few applications where Accenture people have to log in, then Deloitte can itself become like an application for Accenture. So Accenture users will become an identity, like Accenture's Okta will become an identity provider, and Deloitte Okta will become an application. So, and we can do this integration now, considering in their Okta, we can create an app called Deloitte, and then we can add the ACS URL, entity ID, and the attributes required, and we can have this SAML configuration and assign the app to the required project members in Accenture. From Accenture, when they log into this application called Deloitte, they are basically logging into an Okta of Deloitte. Now, once they are in the Deloitte's Okta, then they can see other applications which is integrated with Deloitte. And as a user of Deloitte now, they can log into these different applications. So this is the whole idea behind bringing Org2Org. If the other company like Accenture here did not had Okta, we could have still done this. Similarly, all steps will remain similar except provisioning. And we can integrate with any other identity provider as well, whether it's Ping Identity, OneLogin, and any XYZ identity provider, we can do the same integration. It will just not be called as Org2Org. Basically, this is Org2Org is an Okta coin term. The real term is called inbound SAML federation. So this kind of thing is called inbound SAML federation, and we are going to do that today between two Okta orgs. So as you can see on the screen, I have two different Okta orgs. If you see the URL, it's 5431092, and this is 8213180. I'm going to make this 5431092 as my application Okta, or an Okta which would act as an application, and this will become an identity provider which will have users who need to log into 5431 using the credentials stored in this Okta. Okay. Any questions so far?
No, none here.
Okay. So I will not try to confuse you guys, but again, Okta has coined another term called hub and spoke. So the Okta, which is acting as an application, which is accepting the authentication, which is relying on the authentication of an identity provider's Okta, is called as hub. And the application and the Okta, which is acting as an identity provider, which is having the source of users, is called as spoke. Okay. So hub is like a central component, and users from different spoke can log into this hub. This hub and spoke architecture gives us a scenario like if I am a company selling a product to multiple companies, then I can use one Okta for my product, which I'm selling to different companies. And then different company users can do a single sign-on to my product using their own credentials. This is basically what you will be doing throughout your career, in a nutshell. So you will be integrating Salesforce, Microsoft Office, but on the background, Salesforce may be using some identity provider which we are not aware about. Microsoft may be using some identity provider which we are not aware about, right? We just know Microsoft or Salesforce as an application, and we are integrating that. So your customers will also know your product which you're selling. They would not know whether you're using Okta or not, and you would just integrate that. But it is nothing but an org-to-org connection, and this is very famous. It's done by Adobe. It's done by different other companies as well, which are selling different product. And Adobe is a very big in this, right? So this was a second scenario where customer identity and access management comes into the picture. But yeah, let's get started. So which one is the hub and which one is spoke? Yeah, based on the definition.
You said the one on the left, which is going to be the application, is the hub. The one on the right will be the spoke.
Why will this be hub? You said this is hub, right?
Right. You said because this is going to be our identity provider. Or you said because that's going to be our application. That's where we're going to be receiving the authorization. So that's going to be the hub, and this will be the spoke. The one on the right will be the spoke because that's where the all the information is, and they're just authorizing.
So the hub and spoke architecture is like this. This is hub, okay. Then you have multiple spokes, right? Users from Accenture, Wipro, TCS, XYZ. They can all log into this central Okta using their own Okta, right? This is the architecture of hub and spoke, which also is Okta Org2Org. Considering this all spokes are Okta. If these are not Okta, then this is not an Org2Org architecture. The architecture will remain itself. It's called as inbound Saml, but this will then become inbound Saml Federation. So the idea is these tenants have users who want to authenticate to an application. This tenant has the application where these users want to authenticate. So users will then integrate this Okta, which is here centrally, as an application in their own tenant. In our scenario, what we have is we have only one spoke. So this is hub, right? And we have only one spoke. So the scenario is this central hub has the application which the users of this Okta want to authenticate. And we are going to do an integration between these two Okta tenant. So users using their own credentials will log into this Okta, and from here they can jump to any number of applications they want. Okay. How do I remove this annotation now? Do you know how to remove this annotation?
On the top, can you click on the cog?
Okay, I think it's gone. Okay. All right. So how do you integrate an application using Saml in Okta? Now both the classes know about Saml integration. So can you tell me how do we integrate a Saml application in Okta?
You need the entity ID, ACS URL of the client application, and you need the SSO
Those are the
URL.
SAML. Yeah, so those are the SAML details you will require. But what are the
Yeah,
steps to integrate an app?
go to applications. Applications. You can
Again,
create an
I'll go to applications.
applications. Create an app integration. You might need to remove one of yours because I think the developer tenant only allows 5, right?
I'll remove 2. It should be enough now to fit this. Okay, you said create app
Create app
integration.
integration.
Mhm.
Yeah. Saml 2.0.
Mhm.
Next. Name your application. You can
Okay.
just hit next after that. All right, so you need to grab the SSO URL of your identity or of the from the identity provider. So, or I guess it would be the SSO URL
So you
from,
are from the identity provider?
sorry, from
This is the
the,
identity provider.
yeah, this is the identity provider. So, oh, it's asking for the ACS URL, even though it says single sign-on URL, it's actually asking for the ACS, right?
Okay. Who gives the ACS URL?
The client or the application that
Okay.
we're trying to integrate.
Okay.
So
Now
for,
let's switch the role. Okay. How do we integrate an identity provider in Okta?
oh, so you have to create an identity provider, right? On this, on the window in the left, you have to add an identity provider. I think you have to create it in order for us to get the ACS URL from there. Right? And I don't think it's called the ACS URL when you create the identity provider, right? It's called something else.
Okay, so first so this is the application which we were integrating, right? From the
Yeah.
application side, we get the ACS URL entity ID, correct?
Yep.
And once we have done this integration from the identity provider side, do we share any information to the application?
Think about it. Don't you have to provide? I think you do have to share some information, right?
What are those information?
Um, we would have to share the ACS URL of the app.
ACS
Can you?
URL of the app.
Yeah. So.
No, I'm saying that you have configured the app in Okta.
Mhm.
Now press the
Oh,
Salesforce and Okta integration, right? So you have configured the Salesforce app here in Okta. Now, from Okta, will you share any information to the Salesforce team?
the single sign-on URL.
Okay.
And the entity ID.
Okay.
I think that's it, right? And then possibly a certificate. But I think
Okay.
for the identity provider, you need to have a certificate, right? If you're doing org to
And
org.
forget about Org2Org. Let's focus on application and Saml integration only. So how do we get those information, the SSO URL and the entity ID from our Okta?
For which window? The one on the left or the right? For the application side?
No. Okay, SSO URL belongs to only identity provider. So when I say that in the context, it's only from identity provider side. Okay, let's do one thing. It's confusing you guys. So there is only one window.
Okay.
This is where we are configuring the application.
Yeah.
Application is not Okta. Application is Salesforce, ServiceNow, AWS, any other application, right? Let's assume that this is all configured, right? This is all configured. We have saved this. Now, from
the
Okta side, we have to
metadata.
share the information to the application team. We need to share the SSO URL of our Okta identity provider. We need to share the entity ID of our Okta identity provider. We need to share the certificate of our Okta identity provider. So where do we get those information to share?
From the metadata file that is generated when you create this. And this. So I remember in ours, you did salesforce.com, salesforce.com. And then we generated the metadata file. And then once we had that metadata file, we can provide the information to the other.
Correct. So that's right. So what we need to do is we need to save this configuration first with some dummy information. So currently, let me just say okta.com everywhere. Why we are saving this as dummy information? Because we don't have the real information. And this will not let us save it without providing any information. Or will it?
No, I think last time it didn't.
So that's why we have to provide some dummy information. Instead of okta.com, you can also say google.com. If somebody is wondering why we are doing okta.com, then I can also go with google.com. And I can also go with okta.com. Right? Any dummy information would work, and just hit next and save this configuration somehow. So this is a normal app integration, right? We have saved this app. Is there any difference between what we have done for Salesforce and what we have done now? No, right?
No.
No, none.
Perfect. All right, now if you go to the sign on tab of the application, which you just configure in your identity provider, you have this Saml setup instruction, or you have this certificate where you have this active one and you have action and you can see the metadata, correct? So you have two steps. Either you can click on Saml instructions or you can click on this metadata. I prefer to click on Saml instructions. It's easy, right? So here you have the single sign-on URL of your Okta identity provider. And here you have the entity ID of your Okta identity provider. Please know this is an identity provider, right? Identity provider single sign-on URL, identity provider issuer. Issuer means entity ID. And this is the identity provider certificate. We can also download this certificate. And this is metadata in XML format optionally if you would like. Okay, so we have all this information here in the metadata of the identity provider. Let's say we provided these information to the application team. Now what you have to do in Salesforce to configure, to complete this integration?
I think you have to go into single sign-on settings in Salesforce, and then you have to provide this information over there. And I think you also have to download a certificate from Salesforce, right? Or no, we can upload the metadata file to Salesforce.
Okay. How about ServiceNow? If this application is ServiceNow, then what do we do with this information?
I think I need to redo the service now one. I'm gonna let somebody else take this one.
Okay, what if the application XYZ, what do we do with this information?
We
An
need
unknown
to
application. Yeah,
provide this information to that application so we can bridge the connection, right?
right. So now that application is Okta. Okay. So now let's forget about identity provider. Let's come to the application. This is an application. This is not an identity provider. Okay. This Okta is acting as an application. Similar to what you need to configure in ServiceNow, AWS, Salesforce, what we do is we configure an identity provider in these applications. So in identity provider, we configure application, and in application, we configure identity provider. So since this Okta is acting as an application, we will configure an identity provider here. How do we configure an identity provider? We go to security, identity providers, and we click on add identity provider. So we are defining that this identity provider can be used by this Okta for authentication. And what we are doing is we are configuring a Saml identity provider, right? Because we want to do a Saml connection between these two. So we are configuring a Saml identity provider, and I select Saml IDP and click on next. You can name your identity provider so that you know where it's coming from. So I can say that Spoke. Now it says why are you configuring this identity provider? Do you want to use it for SSO only or as a factor? Please ignore this right now. This is not part of this course, but there is an option of identity as a factor, which is a complicated thing in the what do we say? What is the third Okta certification? Consultant, yeah, for the consultant course or developer, Okta developer course. So let's focus on SSO only. So we are going to use this identity provider for authentication only, and that was simple SSO. Now it says when the response arrives from an identity provider, which is Okta, the other Okta, from the response, how do we know which user is authenticating? So usually in the SAML response, what attribute does application target to identify the user? Anyone?
Is it the email or the username?
There is one key attribute I told you, which you're missing. And that tells me how much
Is
review.
issue the entity ID?
Entity ID is not an attribute which represents a user.
Are you looking for either login or primary email?
Okay, so in SAML response, the key attribute which defines a user is called as subject, SAML subject. Okay. And that attribute has a child attribute which is called as name ID, right? So SAML subject is one where we pass a user information like their email addresses or the username or their employee ID, which is unique information about a user. But the attribute name is called as subject, and the real attribute name is name ID, but its parent attribute name is subject. Okay. So we need to provide how will this application, which is Okta, will get the identify the user. So we are going to say that it will be identifying the user from the attribute called subject and its child object called name ID. So Okta calls it as subject name ID. So we are specifying that. If you have forgotten about this, please review the video of SAML Tracer. And then I have always told you how single sign-on works. When Okta does the authentication and sends a SAML response to the application, let's say Salesforce, then Salesforce reads this value of subject and tries to find if a user exists within this application with this value or not, right? You have seen during our errors, the one common error was unable to map the subject of the user, right? In Saml validator, whatever option that is there in the Salesforce. That's because the incoming user in the response does not match with a user which already exists in Salesforce. So for single sign-on to work, the user account should already be there in the application. And when identity provider like Okta sends a SAML response, it should send the username of the user, whatever it is configured within the Salesforce, as a SAML subject in the response. So what we are telling here in Okta is we would read that subject value and we will compare it against a user stored here in this Okta. If that value matches with any Okta username, we will consider this as a user found. And we will link the incoming account with the existing account here in Okta. This is called as account linking, when you can link account coming from different sources with one single account. If the incoming user does not exist here in this Okta, which is like if no match is found, then what do you want to do? Then we have two options. The common option is do not let them log in because they do not exist in this application. Similarly, what you have seen in Salesforce, if the user does not exist in Salesforce and you assign the app from Okta and you do the SSO, you get an error. Salesforce does not let you log in. So that is one option. The second option is, okay, although the user does not exist in this Okta or in this application, let it be created on the fly, right? Which is called as just in time. So you can create that user based on whatever attribute they are bringing from the identity provider. Then if you have JIT enabled and if a match is found and if user is coming with an attribute value which is already up, like let's say title, right? If the title of the user here in this Okta is web developer, but when user does a SSO using the other Okta and the title has changed from web developer to principal engineer, do you want to update that attribute in this Okta as well? If yes, then you can check this box which says update attributes for existing users. And if the user was disabled here or deactivated here or suspended here and not in the other Okta and still does an authentication to this Okta, do you want to reactivate those deactivated or suspended user? If yes, please check these boxes. If no, then uncheck these boxes. Okay. All right.
Sorry, I had a question. What is the best practice for that? Not to reactivate, or does that just depend on the client?
It depends upon your business requirement. How much restriction do you want to enforce here? Because let's say if you have this option enabled, then basically anybody who gets assigned to that app in the identity provider or spoke side can do a authentication here, right? If they don't exist here, then their account will get created. So then this Okta administrators, which is the application Okta, cannot control who can authenticate to this Okta, right? Then the control went to spoke, correct? Anybody who gets assigned in spoke to the hub Org2Org application gets created in the hub. So if hub wants to control who can authenticate, and also, of course, this control also has to be from the spoke side because they also need to assign the user to that app, then we can enforce this option. So first, this administrator has to create an account here in this Okta, and then only the other admin in the spoke can assign the application. Okay, so now we need to provide our identity providers single sign-on, URL, entity ID, and the certificate, right? Which we already got from the metadata. So we'll go to that metadata and we copy this information. We are copying single sign-on URL. We will paste here in this box which says single sign-on URL. We are copying issuer, which is entity ID. We will copy here in this box which says issuer. We will download the certificate and we will upload the certificate. And now, once it is saved, once it is done, all three information, entity ID is single sign-on URL and certificate. We can click on finish. Now, once you click on finish, this identity provider is configured. And what was this Okta again? What is the role of this Okta? Where we are at now?
This is the hub, the application.
Application, right? An application has entity ID, ACS URL, and the certificate, right? So if you expand this one, you see it has entity ID, ACS URL, certificate is there, but we don't use the certificate to upload in other Okta anyways. You can download the metadata from this application also, and you can see how the application metadata looks like. And to confirm this is an application and not an identity provider, you can see this says SP SSO descriptor. This is also something which I have told you before, how you can differentiate between two metadatas. And here you have these certificates, right? This is the encryption certificate if it wants to use encryption. This is the signing certificate if it just want to sign the and these are the ACS URLs for this application. Okay. And here it has mentioned that first name, last name, and email, right, is a required attribute. Mobile number is false. That means it's not required attribute. And it has given some information about the Okta organization, the display name of the organization, and the URL of this organization, which is nothing but okta.com. Yeah. So this is the metadata. We don't need to use this metadata anyways, but yeah. Where did our Okta? Yeah, here we are. So what we need from here is ACS URL. We copy this and we go to our identity provider Okta. And we then go to the general of our application. And we click on edit here in the Saml settings. Click on next. And update these dummy URLs to the real one, which we are getting from the application now. And paste this, right? And click on next. And now once you configure the application, what is the next step for access management?
Gotta assign users, right?
So you need to do the user assignment. So here you need to assign a user to this application, right? And if this user goes to his end user dashboard, he should be able to see that application. Right here it is, right? Hub Okta SP, this is the application we configured. And we are intending to log into this Okta, which is 5431, using the credentials of Okta 8213, right? So if I just log out, Users tab. I am now logged in only to 813, no other Okta orgs, right? And I click on this application. Now I am logged in to 543. I did not use any credentials to log into 543. I just logged in to 813 and clicked on this application. If this was Salesforce, we clicked on Salesforce and we logged into Salesforce, right? But unfortunately, that was another Okta, so we logged into this Okta. Now, you know about SP initiated? Yes, no, maybe. Do you know what is SP initiated? You don't know what is SP initiated?
That's when the user goes to the application and tries to log in, and then he's redirected to Okta, correct?
Correct. And what was the what is it called? What flow is it called, which we just performed now?
This would be IDP initiated because the user went to the identity provider and launched the application, right?
Correct. So if you want to do an SP initiated where user goes to the service provider first, and then service provider redirects the user to the identity provider for authentication, what you need to do is you need to tell the service provider how to reach the identity provider. We don't do explicitly in most of the apps, but here in the Okta, you have to do it. So you have to go to security, identity providers, and remember this Okta is an application. It's the hub. You have something called routing rules. And in the routing rule, you have to tell which identity provider to use and for whom. So I can say you Okta spoke, right? I can give this as a role name. And I am saying that use this for anyone in this Okta. Basically, I could have done this based on any specific application. So if you're trying to access an application which is integrated in this Okta, in the Hub's Okta, then only you go to any other Okta for authentication. But I'm saying for any application. Do you want to target any specific user or set of users? We can do this based on a domain list. Like if we have users like coming from abc.com, they would only go to other Okta for authentication. Users coming from accenture.com would only go for other authentication because we know that accenture.com is not our domain. So basically these users are coming from some other Okta and you need to send them to their Okta for authentication. If you want to do based on any other attribute, you could have done that by selecting user attribute and the attribute name. And let's say that preferred language equals start or equals English. So all English speaking user go to other Okta and do the authentication. But I want to say anything that means any user. Then the last option is use this identity provider. We don't want to use, when you say Okta, it means the same Okta. Then basically there is no meaning to this rule, right? We want to use some other Okta, which we have configured here as spoke. So we want to use that and we create this rule and we have to activate this rule. So now this rule is activated. Okay, let's log out from all the Oktas. So I'm logging out from identity provider. Done. I am also logging in from my service provider Okta. So I am logged out from both Okta. Now, if I go and log in to my service provider Okta, which was this 543, right? This is the URL of my Okta tenant, correct? So I'll go to this Okta tenant and do an authentication. You will see that it will immediately redirect me to the Okta starting with 83. Oh, sorry, 82. So it has sent me to 82 for authentication. Now I will log in to my Okta, which is an identity provider. And It takes the authentication in the identity provider, and then it reroutes me to the service provider. So this is called SP initiated, and this is org2org. Log into another Okta from one Okta. Any question?
No, that seems fine.
So
Any confusion?
the IDP that we created is actually our service provider. Am I saying that wrong? So
Yes.
in the other tenant, when we went to IDP and we created an IDP, that's actually our service provider.
Okay, so this Okta where you are creating an identity provider is definitely a service provider. Always in service provider, we create an IDP. In Salesforce, we create Okta as an identity provider, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
in identity provider, we create applications. So that's why in the identity provider, we go to applications and we create applications. So in Okta, we create applications.
Okay.
Okay, now let's first deactivate this routing role.
I just had a quick question. Does it matter if they both are admin consoles, like admin tenants?
No, I am admin in both the tenants. I just did a login.
Yeah.
Why such a question? Okay.
Because I was watching one of the videos that they were teaching Okta Org2Org, and they made a third account that wasn't an admin, and it was just a user, and they initiated that as a identity provider instead of a service provider into the service provider. So that's why I was confused.
Okay, yeah, that maybe there's their strategy to just show the user console, not the admin console. But what I did is just this question you asked. Okay,
I
now
had a
what we
question.
did. Mhm,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
My question was about this is obviously creating a custom integration. Would we use the directory? Could we use the directory for this as well? I believe
Yes.
Muhammad was saying something about that, and it'll specifically be called Okta Org2Org.
Yes, so again, it's the same thing, right? When you do the app integration, you can either do a custom integration or you can use the template provided by Okta. So if you want to use a template provided by Okta, then we have a template here called org2org. Okay. So you search for Okta Org2Org and you add this as an application. And you can name this again anything. You can say Okta Hub or whatever. And then you have to provide the URL of your application Okta or your hub, which is nothing but this URL, correct? I copy this URL and paste it. This is the URL of the Okta, which is an application, not the identity provider. Okay, it says target Okta org. And then here we hit next. Select SAML as a protocol. And then you have to provide the hub ACS URL and entity ID. We don't have that information now because we haven't created the identity provider yet. So what we need to do is, again, we need to get the metadata from this Okta org, which is the identity provider, and configure an identity provider in the application. Same what we did before, right? We go click on add identity provider. We can select Saml IDP and it is not getting selected. Saml IDP and click on next. You can name this IDP anything. You have to select SAML subject, right? And then Yeah, you have to copy this issuer from your metadata and put it here. Again, this settings I have already explained what do they mean. So that will mean the same here as well. Paste the sign-on URL. Download the certificate. Upload the certificate. The integration. Now you have your ACS URL, which you can copy. Go to your identity provider, put the ACS URL, copy your entity ID, go to your identity provider, put this URL, and click on done. So your integration is completed. Now you can assign a user like me.
Just to reiterate, I know we talked about this before as well, but on the certification, it doesn't matter which way you do it as long as you get to the right endpoint, correct?
In your certification, first of all, they will not ask you to do an Okta Org. I think, yeah, they will ask you, sorry. So in your certification, you have to do it using the template.
Sorry, I'm not sure. What do you mean? Using the template?
The OIN template.
So you have to select browse catalog and select
okay, I see.
Okta.
I see, yeah, okay.
It's the same thing. It just reduces few of your steps here in the identity provider side. But in the application side, it remains the same. Now, what we did was just SSO, right? Org2Org. And I told you that user must exist on both the side. Otherwise, the user will not log in. And we have seen that in the Salesforce as well, right? The alternate way I told you is you can enable this option called just in time, right? So that if the user is not found, they can get created, right? But just in time only happens at the time of authentication. That's why it's called as just in time, right? When a user is actually authenticating, then it will check if the user exists. If the user exists, all fine. If user does not exist, then it creates a user. But can we create those users beforehand and not manually, automatically? That is called as provisioning, which we have already known, right? We have seen provisioning before also, but we can also do provisioning between two Okta orgs, okay? So in your identity provider, the application which you configure, right, you have this tab called provisioning. In provisioning, you go and click on configure API integration and click on enable API integration. In your application Okta, which is acting as a hub, you have to go to security and API and go to token and create a token. I can say Okta spoke and click on create token and copy this token value and click on OK. Go to your identity provider and paste this token and click on test credentials. It went successful. Click on save. Now, once you have saved this, then you have an option. You have to go to to app. To app means from this identity provider Okta, the provisioning goes to the application Okta. To Okta means from the application Okta, it goes to the identity provider Okta. App is what we have configured, and to Okta is the same Okta. So in to app, you have to enable create user, update user, deactivate user, so that the identity provider can create user or update an existing user or deactivate an existing user in the application Okta. And you can click on save. Once done, now if you assign any user, let's say you want to assign a user called Tim Horton who does not exist in your application Okta side. So if you go to directory people and if you look for Tim Horton, there is no user as such, right? So if you assign Tim Horton from your identity provider Okta or Spoke and click on save. So initial status is very important. It says active with password. That means when this user will be pushed to this Okta, the user will be an active user and he will have some password. If you say active pending with password, that means the user will not be in active status, user will be in pending action required, right? Most of the time, we would always go with active with pass and click on save and done. So we have assigned him. Refresh this to just check if there are any errors, provisioning errors or not. There are no provisioning errors for Tim, right? To verify he was created in the application Okta successfully, you can do two checks. One, click on this edit button and check for this ID called external ID. This is nothing but an ID which got created in the application Okta. So if you now go to the application Okta and go to directory people, you are able to see Tim Horton automatically appearing in this tenant now. And the user is active. And if you click on the user, you can see all the attributes which was there in the other Okta, apart from the custom attribute, if any, right? So this way we were able to push an user from the spoke to the hub or identity provider to the service provider automatically. This is called as provisioning. If this user is deactivated in the spoke, let's say I deactivate this user in the spoke, right? User got deactivated in the hub, which is the application Okta. This user will also get deactivated. So the spoke can control the user creation process in the hub for their own users. So if this is an integration between Deloitte and Accenture, and if Accenture users are logging into Deloitte, then Accenture admins can control who gets access to Deloitte. And if they leave Accenture, then they can deactivate the account in Deloitte from the Accenture side itself. They don't need to log into Deloitte and or ask the Deloitte admins to deactivate the user. Once deactivated in the Accenture Okta, user gets deactivated in the Deloitte Okta also.
This would be lifecycle management.
Correct.
So where did you go in your IDP or you went to provisioning?
Yes. So you have to go to your app, which you have configured here as hub. You go to provisioning tab. And that point of time, you will not have these options. The only option which you have is this. So you paste a security token, which you will get from the application side Okta by clicking on security API, right? Any question?
I just want to say thank you for the clarification. I really appreciate it.
Problem?
Yeah, I was trying to do it by myself and I was getting confused, but this makes it a lot clearer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope it helps for your examination and to both of the batches. This is one of the important topic, not for just for the examination, but also in real life when you join an Okta administrator. This is very common implementation in all the companies.
I think what really just made it confusing is Okta's naming conventions. Like the ACS is called the sign on, and then, the application we would do in the IDP. So, not having much of a background in this, it made it a little confusing, but this clarified it. Thank you again.
So, as an exercise, definitely do this, practice this, but as an exercise, sign up for another identity provider called OneLogin. So OneLogin is also an identity provider like Okta, right? They are also similar product, and configure an org2org using OneLogin and Okta. Create OneLogin as an identity provider or spoke, and Okta as a hub or service provider. Can you do it?
I can try.
You
I think I
certainly
can.
should be able to do it, right? It's just any other app integrations. Now, even if we give you 100 app integrations, you should be able to do it, right? So you can remember steps of only 10, 5, 15 applications. But when you start working as Okta administrator, you'll integrate 200, 300 applications. And there will be applications which you have never seen, never heard of, but you have to integrate. You don't need any documentation or nothing. What you basically need is your basic Saml concepts, and it should work.
I think all we need is practice. I feel like it makes it a lot easier the more you do it.
That is for true. So practice makes a man perfect. So do your practice. Practice this as well. This is a task. Yeah, all you need to is navigate between the one login console, understand their console a little bit, how to configure an app in one login and so on. It's pretty easy, but try this. All right, I am 10 minutes overboard, so I will leave you guys. And yeah, I believe everything is clear. If not, let me know.
Okay, thank you for your time.
No problem.
Thank you, Saml.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was good being